The neon lights of the downtown bar flickered in erratic bursts, casting fractured shadows over the hardwood floor slick with spilled beer. The music thumped like a heartbeat, too loud to ignore, too insistent to fade into the background. On one side of the room, a group of Marines laughed uproariously, slapping backs, sloshing glasses, and shouting over the bass-heavy music. Their uniforms were long gone, replaced with civilian clothes that didn't hide the strength in their shoulders or the ease with which they could dominate a fight. The air smelled of alcohol, sweat, and cigarette smoke, a heady, almost suffocating mix that made the tension in the room taste sharp on the tongue. At the far end of the bar, a young woman sat alone, a slender figure hunched over a glass of whiskey. She seemed absorbed in her drink, her eyes distant, darting occasionally toward the entrance and the crowd with a subtle, calculated vigilance. Her auburn hair framed her face, soft in the light, but her gaze betrayed nothing soft at all. It was the kind of gaze that measured, that calculated, that scanned every movement in the room and every potential threat, all without anyone suspecting a thing. To the untrained eye, she was just another woman having a drink on a Friday night. Then came the Marine. He was tall, broad, the kind of presence that dominated the room without trying. He laughed too loud, moving too fast, bumping into tables and people as though the world revolved around him. When he slammed into her, spilling his drink across the table and onto her sleeve, she didn't flinch. Her expression remained unreadable, her posture composed, almost statuesque. "Hey, watch where you're going," the Marine barked, his voice carrying over the music. He shoved her slightly, just enough to make her drink wobble. Laughter erupted from his friends. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. That was when he froze. There was something in her stare, cold, precise, sharp enough to cut glass, that stopped him in his tracks. The crowd sensed it too. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. A waitress hesitated with a tray of drinks. Even the DJ seemed to glance briefly at the interaction, as if sensing that something unseen had shifted the room's energy. The Marine, never one to back down, smirked, assuming the intimidation was one-sided. "You think you can just sit there and," he started, but she raised a single finger almost lazily and the words died in his throat. Her presence was magnetic, almost unnerving. People around them instinctively leaned back, creating a small bubble of space between the two. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't threatening, but the sheer authority in her posture demanded attention. She brushed her hand along the edge of her purse, almost casually, fingers grazing a concealed piece of equipment, a flash drive, perhaps a miniature device, capable of operations he couldn't begin to imagine. Her calm was deliberate, controlled, but underneath it lay a readiness honed by years of training, a kind of quiet power that could strike in an instant. The Marine's smirk faltered. He shuffled closer, thinking he could assert dominance by proximity. "You got a problem, lady," he barked. His voice was louder now, bordering on reckless. She didn't respond immediately. She exhaled slowly, almost like a predator assessing prey, measuring the next move. The silence between them grew heavy, each second a subtle escalation. Around them, the crowd's chatter dimmed, replaced by an almost tangible tension. A group of students near the corner of the bar nudged each other nervously, exchanging whispered guesses about who would back down first. Nobody had any idea what they were witnessing. To them, it was just a bar confrontation. But for those who understood, it was a collision between two forces, one fully aware and one completely blind. The Marine, frustrated by her stillness, shoved her harder. This time her reaction was barely perceptible, a subtle step to the side, a tilt of her wrist, but it was enough to unbalance him. Drinks splashed onto the floor, the sound of glass shattering sharp and sudden. Gasps echoed through the bar. Some laughed nervously, others murmured warnings. Then she leaned in slightly. Just a fraction, almost imperceptible, and the room seemed to tighten around her. The Marine's confident posture faltered. His friends noticed it too, a hesitation that had never been there before. He didn't know it, but he was standing on the edge of a precipice, unaware that the woman in front of him was not just anyone. She was a Marine's worst nightmare in civilian disguise. Her voice finally cut through the music, soft but absolute. "Step back," she said. No pleading, no uncertainty, just command. It carried an authority that didn't need volume, one that made him pause mid-step, muscles tensing. She didn't need to touch him, her presence alone was enough. For a moment the bar was suspended in stillness. The air felt heavier, charged, almost electric. The Marine looked around, searching for support from his friends, but even they seemed unsure now, sensing something beyond their comprehension. She didn't flinch, didn't move, yet every fiber of her being screamed readiness, training, lethal precision hidden beneath ordinary attire. Then a subtle flash on her wrist caught his eye, a faint green light blinking for just a fraction of a second. He didn't understand it, but instinctively a cold shiver ran down his spine. Something had been triggered. A signal, a warning, something he couldn't see but could feel. The Marine's eyes widened, realization dawning too late. He had no idea what he had provoked. The room's background noise returned in muted waves, but the tension between them remained, a taut wire stretched to its limit. Patrons instinctively moved back, giving them space. Even the bartender, wiping a counter nearby, paused mid-motion, sensing the invisible storm gathering in the center of the bar. Before anyone could act further, the sound of a chair scraping sharply against the floor turned heads. Another presence had entered the periphery of the room, a subtle, almost silent arrival. But the Marine, still focused on the woman in front of him, didn't notice it, and neither did the rest of the bar. Yet the unseen observer registered every movement, every heartbeat, and every micro-expression. The woman tilted her head slightly, watching him with calculated precision. Her eyes, sharp as flint, betrayed nothing of her next move, but the tension it created was almost unbearable. The Marine realized he had crossed a line, but it was too late. She didn't move aggressively, didn't raise a fist, yet somehow she had already dominated the room without lifting a hand. And in that brief, electric moment, as the lights flickered and shadows danced across the floor, he knew deep down that his life had intersected with something far beyond his understanding. He had no idea who she really was, and the realization of that fact hit him harder than any punch ever could. The bar held its breath, the music a distant pulse, the neon lights painting jagged lines across faces frozen in suspense. Everyone could feel it, the calm before a storm, the fragile moment before inevitability. And then, almost imperceptibly, her hand brushed her purse again, fingers lingering on something hidden. The Marine's pulse jumped. Something was coming, he didn't know what, but he was about to find out. The Marine stepped back, the alcohol-fueled bravado slowly draining from his posture. He had always been confident in confrontations, a soldier in every sense, trained to intimidate, to assert dominance. But now, facing her, his usual tactics felt crude, childish even. He blinked, trying to make sense of the unflinching calm in her eyes, the way her fingers lingered near her purse in a motion so subtle it almost seemed accidental. She was small, almost delicate in appearance, but there was a dangerous precision in her stance, a hidden power that radiated invisibly through the room. He glanced around at his friends, hopping to rally support, to find backup in the familiar faces that usually bolstered his ego. But their expressions mirrored his own confusion and apprehension. The laughter that had filled the bar moments ago had vanished like smoke. Chairs scraped quietly across the floor, glasses rattled in the dim neon glow, and every patron seemed to hold their breath. The bar itself had become a stage, with them the actors caught in an unspoken, tense drama. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him, not with anger, not with fear, but with a clinical detachment that unnerved him. There was no reaction to the shove, no emotional response, nothing that would satisfy the rules of normal social confrontation. And yet he could feel her presence pressing against him, a quiet force that demanded recognition. It was instinctive, primal, the kind of intimidation that didn't require a raised voice or clenched fist. The Marine's friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in the air. One muttered something under his breath, too quiet for anyone else to hear, but the tension was contagious. He tried to laugh, an awkward, forced sound, hopping to mask the flicker of fear creeping up his spine. "Relax, it's just a drink, right?" he said, raising his hand slightly, a gesture meant to assert dominance but coming across as hesitant. She didn't smile. She didn't react. She simply exhaled, a controlled breath that seemed to slow time around them. Her calm was deliberate, deliberate in a way that suggested hours, years, decades of practice in maintaining composure under stress. Her hand brushed along the purse again, almost as if checking, but not for herself, for him. A subtle message hidden in the smallest of movements, one that spoke volumes to someone trained to read the slightest cues. The Marine's smirk faltered further. He had underestimated her, and that realization sparked a ripple of panic he couldn't quite name. He had been a soldier, yes, but she was something else entirely. Someone who existed in a world he could barely imagine, a world of operations, covert assignments, missions that required both patience and deadly efficiency. He had no idea she was trained to read every micro-expression, every breath, every flicker of hesitation. He took a cautious step closer, trying to reassert control. "Look, lady," he said, voice lower now, tinged with uncertainty. "You don't want to make this." She cut him off with a single word, calm, controlled, delivered with authority that made him stop mid-sentence. "Back." The word was soft, almost casual, but the weight behind it pressed against him with undeniable force. He froze, chest tightening, as if some invisible hand had slammed into him. Around them, the crowd reacted instinctively. A few patrons leaned back, some held drinks tighter, and the bartender paused mid-wipe, sensing that the energy in the room had shifted from confrontation to something unspoken, almost dangerous. She tilted her head, gaze never leaving his. Her calmness wasn't passive, it was active, controlled, a deliberate display of readiness. Her hand lingered near the purse again, and he noticed the subtle glint of metal, a flash of something hidden, something he couldn't identify. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was seeing, but it made no sense. This wasn't normal. This wasn't civilian behavior. The Marine's pulse quickened. He felt it in his chest, a fast, anxious beat, and in his hands, trembling slightly despite himself. He had been hit before, tested in physical confrontations countless times, but this was different. The force he faced was invisible, a tension in the air, a silent threat that required no words, no fists, no weapons. And in the depths of his training, he knew something about her presence alone demanded respect, caution, and fear. He tried to laugh again, weaker this time, but it sounded hollow even to him. "You think you're gonna scare me?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to sound strong. She exhaled slowly, almost lazily, and the sound alone had the effect of slowing his racing thoughts. The calm control she exhibited was almost suffocating in its intensity. Her body was relaxed, but every movement, every glance, every fraction of an inch betrayed lethal precision. The Marine had no idea that in another life, under different circumstances, her gaze could freeze trained operatives in their tracks. A sudden movement caught his eye, a flicker at the edge of her wristwatch. A small green light blinked once and disappeared. He didn't understand it, but his instincts screamed that it meant something. A signal, a warning, something he was too naive to comprehend. And in that moment, the air in the bar felt charged, heavy, like the pause before a storm breaks. The Marine's confidence wavered completely. He realized he had misjudged her entirely, that he had provoked someone far beyond his experience or understanding. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. Around them, people sensed it too, the quiet, palpable weight of a confrontation that was no longer a matter of social etiquette or spilled drinks. Something far greater had been set in motion. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert some sense of control, but the words caught in his throat. Nothing he could say would change the situation. Nothing he could do would rectify the imbalance he had just stumbled into. His bravado, the shield of arrogance that had served him well in countless altercations, had crumbled completely. And then, in a subtle, almost imperceptible motion, she adjusted her posture, shifting ever so slightly, and the Marine realized, too late, that this was only the beginning. She hadn't attacked, hadn't threatened overtly, but every fiber of her being radiated readiness, competence, and lethal potential. He had no idea what he had just triggered, and that ignorance was suddenly terrifying. The bar seemed to shrink around them, the noise fading into a low, pulsing hum as if the room itself had recognized the tension. The Marine took a half step back, chest tightening, mind spinning with adrenaline and disbelief. He could see every eye in the room watching, could feel the weight of expectation and fear pressing down, but most of all, he felt her presence, an invisible force that he could neither confront nor flee from. And then, without warning, her hand brushed against the purse again. This time, the movement was deliberate, confident, almost like a signal. He caught a glint of something hidden beneath the leather, something that should have terrified him more than he could admit. His stomach churned, and a thought, cold and undeniable, struck him. He was no longer facing a woman in a bar. He was facing a trained operative, a predator in human form, and he had no idea how close he had come to crossing a line that could have cost him everything. The moment stretched, frozen in time, a taut wire of tension between them. The crowd held its collective breath, and in that instant the Marine realized he was trapped, not by walls, not by people, but by the quiet, unyielding power of someone who could dismantle him without ever raising a hand. He had provoked a force beyond his comprehension, and she hadn't even moved yet. The Marine's confidence had evaporated, replaced by an unfamiliar, gnawing unease. He had faced threats before, skirmishes that demanded force and firepower, but this was different. There was no visible weapon, no menacing growl, no brash intimidation. And yet the tension radiating from her was lethal, a presence that made his muscles tighten, his mind race, and his heart pound like a drumbeat of warning. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of her purse, fingers lingering on something he couldn't see. A subtle movement, barely perceptible to anyone else, but to the trained eye, the motion screamed readiness. She wasn't just alert, she was anticipating every micro-movement he might make, reading him as if he were a book whose pages were laid bare. The Marine realized with sudden clarity that he had no idea who he was really dealing with. "Step back," she said again, her voice calm, low, but carrying a weight that made him stumble backward. Not in fear, at least, not entirely, but in recognition. Recognition that she was no ordinary woman, that his assumptions about dominance and intimidation were irrelevant here. Her gaze didn't just meet his, it dissected him, examined him, catalogued every micro-expression, every twitch of muscle, every sign of hesitation. Around them, the bar's energy shifted. Conversations dwindled, laughter vanished, and patrons instinctively created space, forming a subtle protective circle around the tense tableau at the center. Some whispered, others froze mid-motion, sensing a drama unfolding beyond their comprehension. Even the DJ, oblivious to details, turned down the music just slightly, as if the air itself demanded reverence for the charged moment. The Marine's friends exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his forearm, leaned closer and muttered under his breath, "What's her deal?" But the question went unanswered. The woman's focus was entirely on him. She didn't glance at anyone else, didn't flinch at the murmurs or stares. She was entirely present, entirely in control, entirely untouchable. The Marine, chest tightening, tried to reclaim some semblance of authority. He moved forward again, a hand raised, ready to assert himself. "Listen," he said, voice shaking more than he wanted to admit. "I didn't." She interrupted with a subtle shift of her weight, just a fraction of an inch, and the Marine froze mid-step. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it conveyed a message he instinctively understood. Stop. Back down. Any misstep now and you could regret it for the rest of your life. The calm control radiating from her wasn't passive, it was active, a weapon wielded with precision. He swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. Something deep in his instincts screamed at him, warning him that this confrontation was no longer about spilled drinks or bar etiquette. He had triggered something dangerous, something that his experience as a Marine had never prepared him for. And then came the glint, a flicker of light at her wristwatch. Just a small, quick flash, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but it was enough. Enough to unsettle him, enough to make him realize she had tools, methods, and training he couldn't comprehend. It was a signal. He didn't know what it meant, but his body reacted before his mind could catch up. Every muscle tensed, every nerve fired, every instinct screamed. This woman was not to be underestimated. The bar's patrons had moved to the edges, sensing the invisible barrier forming around them. The tension was like static electricity, thick in the air, making hair rise on the back of the neck, making skin crawl. Drinks wobbled in hands, glasses clinked nervously on tables, and somewhere near the door, a waitress paused mid-step, realizing that the normal rules of reality had shifted. The Marine tried to speak again, but the words came out hollow. You can't, his voice faltered, broken by the realization of his own vulnerability. He had been trained for combat, for confrontation, for domination, but he was entirely unprepared for this. She wasn't just a challenge. She was an enigma wrapped in lethal precision, and he had no idea what she was capable of. Her eyes softened just slightly, but not in mercy. It was a professional calculation, a controlled assessment. She wasn't here to escalate, not yet, but she was aware. She was aware of every potential threat, every nuance, every possible outcome. And that awareness, that quiet, lethal control, radiated like a warning. The Marine's heart pounded in his chest. He felt the weight of his own ignorance pressing down on him. He had assumed dominance in a bar, assumed control, assumed safety. And now he realized how disastrously wrong he had been. This wasn't just a woman who could defend herself. She was trained to neutralize threats, to survive situations that would terrify even seasoned operatives. And he had inadvertently positioned himself in one of those situations. A subtle motion drew his eye again, a slight tap of her fingers against the metal clasp of her purse. He didn't know what it was, didn't understand what purpose it served, but instinct told him that it wasn't ordinary. Every instinct in his body screamed, "Do not move, do not provoke, do not make a sound." And then, almost imperceptibly, she shifted her stance, ever so slightly, coiling like a spring. Not a threatening motion, not yet, but the promise was there. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Every breath, every movement, every glance felt magnified, charged with a sense of impending consequence. The Marine swallowed, realizing the depth of his mistake. He had misjudged her entirely. This was no ordinary encounter. He was no longer in familiar territory. Every step he had taken, every shove, every casual gesture had set off a chain reaction he couldn't see and couldn't control. And the woman before him, so calm, so composed, so terrifyingly competent, was fully aware of it. Time seemed to stretch, the room narrowing around them. He felt exposed, vulnerable, a novice in a game he hadn't even known existed. He could feel the pulse of her readiness radiating outward, felt the subtle threat embedded in every micro-movement. And in that instant, he knew the truth. He had awakened something dangerous, something he had no idea how to contend with. And then, barely audible over the muffled music, came a quiet sound. A faint, almost imperceptible click from her wrist, the faintest whir of a device activating. He caught it instinctively and his pulse spiked. Whatever was coming next, it was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, unavoidable. He took a cautious half-step back, chest tight, mind racing, as the woman's calm, deadly presence anchored him in place. The bar, once a familiar place of laughter and casual chaos, had transformed into a stage for something far greater, far more dangerous than he could imagine. And in that suspended moment, with the crowd holding its collective breath, the Marine understood the truth. He was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and entirely in over his head. The quiet click echoed again, faint but deliberate, and he realized this was a warning, a signal, a declaration that the woman he had shoved was not to be trifled with. And whatever came next, he had no choice but to face it. The Marine's pulse raced, each beat echoing in his chest like a drum signaling impending doom. He could feel the woman's calm authority pressing down on him, a force that had nothing to do with size or strength. She was small, unassuming, almost fragile in appearance, but every fiber of her being screamed lethal competence. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. Before he could gather his thoughts, or even summon the courage to retreat, the door at the far end of the bar slammed open. The sudden intrusion cut through the tension like a knife. All heads turned instinctively, glasses rattling as conversations faltered. A group of uniformed officers stormed inside, moving with precision, eyes scanning the room as if expecting something to erupt at any second. The Marines' confusion skyrocketed. What was happening? Who had called them? And why were they here now? The woman's eyes flicked toward the intruders, calm as ever, but the corner of her mouth hinted at something almost imperceptible, a knowing smile, a recognition. The officers didn't immediately approach her. Their focus remained on the Marine, whose bravado had completely dissolved under the weight of the situation. He raised his hands instinctively, voice cracking. I didn't. You need to calm down, one of the officers barked, stepping forward. The Marine's friends exchanged panicked glances, unsure of what to do. But the Marine was frozen, caught between fear, confusion, and an unsettling realization that he had no idea what he was dealing with. The woman remained perfectly still, her posture relaxed, yet radiating a presence that demanded attention. The lead officer's gaze flicked toward her, and in that brief, electric moment, recognition passed between them. A split-second glance, a silent understanding that conveyed volumes to those trained to read subtle cues. She was not a civilian. She was not just any woman in a bar. She was someone of consequence, someone whose presence here explained the sudden escalation in tension. The Marine's heart pounded as the officers approached him, their movements precise, professional, yet cautious. He tried to speak, but the words failed him. He had been trained to handle pressure, to face chaos head-on. But this was beyond anything he had encountered. The calm authority radiating from her was suffocating, almost tangible, and the officers seemed to instinctively defer to it, even if only subtly. She's who? The Marine muttered under his breath, not daring to look directly at her. His voice was a mixture of awe, fear, and confusion. One officer whispered something into a radio, voice low and urgent, and the Marine's unease deepened. Whatever was happening, it was serious, and he was entirely out of his depth. The woman tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the officers, yet making no move to intervene directly. Her calm was deliberate, controlled, and unnerving. The Marine realized that she wasn't just present, she was in command of the situation without even lifting a hand. The air around her seemed to hum with silent authority, a force that made him shrink back instinctively. One of the officers gestured toward the Marine, and the man's friend stepped forward, hesitating. But the Marine remained frozen, caught between panic and fascination. He had thought the confrontation would be simple, routine even, just a shove, a bit of embarrassment. But now he understood he had stumbled into something far more complex, far more dangerous than a simple bar fight. The woman shifted subtly, a motion so small it almost went unnoticed, but the Marine caught it. It was a signal of control, of readiness, of lethal intent contained beneath the surface. He realized with a growing sense of dread that he had brushed against someone who operated in a world of precision and consequence he could not imagine. The officers moved closer, forming a semicircle around the Marine. Their expressions were a mix of caution and urgency. He could feel their awareness, their recognition that he was potentially in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in that moment, the woman finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Let him go," she said, calm, commanding. The Marine flinched at the authority in her tone. The officers hesitated, exchanging glances before reluctantly stepping back. The Marine's mind reeled. He had no idea how she had done it, no idea how a single voice, a single presence could control trained officers without a single threat of violence. The bar's patrons watched silently, captivated, aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The laughter, the chatter, the casual chaos of the evening had vanished entirely. All eyes were on the Marine and the woman, and the air was thick with unspoken questions. Who was she? What was she capable of? And why had she arrived at this very moment? The Marine tried to gather his thoughts, to reclaim some sense of control, but every instinct screamed that he was outmatched. He had underestimated her. He had assumed dominance based on size, bravado, and experience, but she had dismantled him with a presence, a gaze, and a subtle signal he couldn't even begin to interpret. Then, almost imperceptibly, the woman tapped her wristwatch again. A soft click, a faint whirring sound, something activated. The Marine noticed it immediately and panic surged through him. Whatever she had triggered, it was serious, immediate, dangerous, and entirely beyond his comprehension. The officers, still tense but obedient, gave her a wide berth, their own awareness of the situation growing with every second. The Marine's mind raced. He had been trained to anticipate threats, to respond to aggression, to assert dominance in any confrontation. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. She was a predator in plain sight, a storm wrapped in calm, and he had no idea what would happen next. Her eyes met his again, steady and unyielding, and the Marine realized the full gravity of his mistake. He had entered a world he could barely understand, a world governed by rules he couldn't see. He was a novice, exposed, vulnerable, and entirely out of his depth. And then, without warning, she moved. Not aggressively, not with hostility, but with a purpose that sent a chill down his spine. She stepped toward the officers, her movements precise, controlled, and deliberate. The Marine followed instinctively, heart pounding, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. He realized in that instant that his life had intersected with someone who could operate anywhere, handle anyone, and manipulate circumstances with a calm precision he couldn't begin to fathom. The bar, once a place of casual chaos and routine Friday night revelry, had become a stage for a quiet, unseen war. And the Marine, for the first time in his life, knew he had no idea how close he had come to disaster. Hours had passed since the incident at the bar, yet the Marine could still feel the weight of it pressing down on him, a suffocating mixture of awe, fear, and disbelief. He sat slumped in a dimly lit back room of the precinct, his uniform long forgotten, sleeves rolled up, fingers tapping nervously on the table. He had been trained to face chaos, to react under pressure, but nothing in his years as a Marine had prepared him for this level of confrontation. Across from him, the woman who had absorbed his aggression, who had frozen him with nothing but a gaze and a subtle gesture, stood with the composure of someone who owned every inch of the room. Her hair was pulled back, the faint glow of overhead fluorescent lights glinting off the sharp lines of her face. Her eyes, sharp as daggers, never wavered. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream or lash out. She simply existed, and the Marine realized with a sinking heart that it was more terrifying than any weapon he had faced. He tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. I didn't know," he began, voice faltering. I had no idea." She raised a hand, stopping him. "Do you understand now?" she asked, calm, almost clinical. Her tone carried no malice, but the weight of it pinned him in place. Her presence was a force in itself, commanding attention, respect, and obedience without so much as a raised finger. He blinked, taking a hesitant breath. Who are you?" His voice was barely more than a whisper, though it carried the tension of a man on the edge of comprehension. Her expression softened ever so slightly, the faintest trace of a knowing smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "You hit a Navy SEAL," she said flatly. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Everything around him seemed to warp in that instant. The room, the fluorescent lights, even the air itself. He had been confronted by someone trained for combat at the highest levels, someone whose missions were classified, whose life existed in the shadows of national security. The Marine staggered back slightly, trying to process the reality. A SEAL, here, in a bar. The absurdity of it made no difference to the growing terror inside him. His mind raced, replaying every micro-movement, every flicker of her expression, every subtle gesture he had overlooked. It all suddenly clicked into place, and a cold dread settled over him. He had provoked someone who could dismantle him entirely, without ever raising her voice, without ever resorting to violence. She stepped closer, measured, precise, like a predator closing in on prey, not to attack, but to assert presence. The Marine could feel the controlled power in her movements, the lethal grace of someone who had trained her body and mind to function as one instrument of precise action. He realized painfully that she was far more than he had imagined. She was a force of nature, invisible yet absolute. One of the officers, quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. "Her operations are classified at the highest level," he said in a low, urgent tone. "You have no idea what you've just walked into." The Marine's stomach churned. He understood now that he was not merely embarrassed or chastised. He had stumbled into the orbit of someone whose life involved missions that could alter the outcome of national security operations. The woman's gaze never left him. "I don't retaliate unnecessarily," she said softly, almost conversationally. "But I don't forgive ignorance either." Her voice was calm, yet every word carried the weight of consequence. The Marine shivered. He understood in a visceral, gut-wrenching way that she could make his life miserable or end it entirely if she chose to. He struggled to find words, to assert something, anything that could salvage his dignity. I thought I was just." "You thought wrong," she interrupted, tone sharp but controlled. "You assumed, as most people do, that you could push someone around, that you could assert dominance based on size and noise. You assumed incorrectly." Her words were precise, cutting through the haze of his panic like a scalpel. The Marine's face flushed. Humiliation mixed with awe, leaving him feeling exposed and utterly powerless. For a long moment the room was silent. The Marine's hands trembled slightly, the gravity of his mistake settling over him like a physical weight. The woman exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, her posture relaxed yet impossibly commanding. She wasn't angry, not yet, but the implication of her calm presence was clear. He had been tested and found wanting. And then, with deliberate care, she removed her jacket, revealing the faint emblem on her shirt, a Navy SEAL insignia, sharp and unmistakable under the fluorescent light. The Marine's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just her training, her composure, or her precision that terrified him. It was the fact that he had hit someone capable of missions he couldn't even comprehend, someone whose world operated in stakes that dwarfed his own. His jaw fell open slightly. You're a SEAL." The words sounded foolish, even to him. He had trained, fought, and survived against the toughest opposition he could imagine, but this was different. This was someone who could dismantle entire operations without raising a weapon. She nodded once, small, deliberate, almost as if confirming a fact that needed no ceremony. "I am, and you just gave me a reason to notice you." Her voice was calm, but the subtle implication was electric. The Marine's stomach twisted. He had no idea what notice entailed, but instinct screamed it was not a casual observation. The room seemed to constrict around him, walls closing in. Every detail, the fluorescent lighting, the muted chatter of officers outside, the faint hum of the air conditioning, faded into insignificance. He was trapped, caught between fear and fascination, realizing that his life had intersected with someone capable of far more than he could comprehend. And then she smiled, a small, cold, knowing smile that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't warm. It was professional, precise, a reminder that the world she operated in obeyed rules he could not see. That smile, brief as it was, carried the weight of experience, competence, and lethal potential. The Marine's friends shifted nervously in the background. He realized that he had been operating under assumptions that had blinded him completely. Every shove, every careless glance, every ounce of bravado had been irrelevant. He had provoked someone who didn't need confrontation, but whose mere presence could command obedience, fear, and respect simultaneously. Before he could react further, her phone buzzed, breaking the tension in the room. A single encrypted message lit up the screen and her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She glanced at the Marine one last time, her gaze unreadable, then pocketed the device. Whatever had arrived was urgent, classified, and beyond the Marine's comprehension. And in that instant he understood he had been lucky. She could have been merciless. She could have taken action. She could have done things he wasn't prepared to witness or survive. And yet she had spared him, leaving him stunned, shaken, and acutely aware of just how small and unprepared he truly was in her presence. The room seemed to hum with the unspoken tension of revelation. The Marine felt a mixture of awe, fear, and disbelief. He had brushed against greatness, against lethal competence hidden in plain sight. And as she moved toward the door, ready to leave on whatever mission had summoned her attention, he realized his life had intersected with someone who existed entirely on a different plane, a world of secrets, of missions, of deadly precision, and he had survived. For now, the bar had emptied, but the memory of that night lingered in the Marine's mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. He had gone home, tried to sleep, tried to convince himself it was just a fluke, that maybe he had overreacted. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the calm precision, the measured movements, the eyes that seemed to read his soul. He could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on him, even from a distance, a force he could neither understand nor escape. He replayed the moment endlessly, the shove, the frozen stare, the subtle signals, and the flick of her wristwatch. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a warning, a test, and perhaps a statement of dominance that left him utterly exposed. He had been trained for danger, for confrontation, for battle, but nothing had prepared him for this level of awareness, this depth of skill hidden behind an unassuming exterior. The next morning he went to the precinct, hoping for some clarity. He found her gone, but the officers who had intervened were still there, speaking in hushed tones about classified operations and high-level coordination. He lingered near the doorway, trying to catch fragments of conversation, trying to understand a world that had just brushed up against his own. His curiosity collided with fear. He had a million questions, but none of the answers would come easily. He learned that her missions were covert, the kind that left no paper trail, the kind that could alter outcomes far beyond the comprehension of ordinary citizens, or even fellow soldiers. And he realized with a sinking certainty that the bar incident was nothing compared to the operations she undertook daily. He had brushed against a professional force capable of shaping events on a scale he couldn't grasp. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had been in the area for personal reasons. Maybe her presence in the bar was coincidental, but even that thought made him uneasy. There was nothing coincidental about the way she moved, the way she observed, the way she assessed him without effort. Everything about her was deliberate. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle motion carried purpose. The Marine found himself thinking about her constantly. At work, he replayed the events in his head, analyzing her expressions, her subtle signals. He wondered what she had seen in him. Was it potential? Was it threat? Or had she simply been amused by the encounter? The thought made him uneasy because he knew she could dismantle him entirely without lifting a finger if she wished. He went back to the bar several times under the pretense of casual visits, hoping to catch another glimpse of her. Each time he was disappointed, or perhaps relieved. The place felt different now, quieter, almost hollow, as if the air itself remembered the tension that had erupted there. Patrons seemed to move differently, officers glancing occasionally toward the door, whispers lingering in the corners. The Marine's obsession grew, a mix of awe and fear driving him deeper into reflection. And then, weeks later, he got a glimpse of her again, brief, almost imperceptible, walking past a cafe near the pier. She moved with the same lethal grace, the same quiet authority, her gaze briefly meeting his before moving on. In that instant, he realized that her world was entirely different from his, a life lived on the edge of danger and secrecy, a world he had unknowingly entered and survived. He tried to tell his friends about her, about the encounter, about the sheer weight of her presence, but they laughed or shook their heads. They couldn't understand, couldn't grasp the reality he had faced. No words could convey the magnitude of the force he had inadvertently challenged. No casual description could capture the precision, the discipline, the quiet lethality he had witnessed. Days turned into weeks, and the Marine's life resumed its usual rhythm, yet nothing felt normal anymore. Every shadow, every glance, every encounter carried the echo of that night. He felt exposed in ways he couldn't explain. He realized painfully that he had brushed against a reality far beyond his understanding. He had touched the surface of someone who operated in secrecy, danger, and precision at a level he could barely comprehend, and he had survived by the narrowest margin of luck and restraint. Then came the message, a simple note delivered through channels he couldn't trace, brief but unmistakably linked to her. It read, "Be aware, not everything is as it seems, stay alert." No signature, no explanation, just a warning. The Marine's stomach churned. He didn't understand why she had sent it, what threat she was referencing, or whether it was a personal caution or part of a larger operation. But he felt it in his bones. The danger was real, immediate, and unavoidable. The Marine began to notice subtle changes in his environment. People around him seemed different, almost as if he were being watched. Incidents cropped up, unexplained phone calls, strangers lingering at a distance, moments that seemed ordinary but carried hidden significance. His training allowed him to notice anomalies, but he had never encountered anything like this. Every instinct screamed that he had become part of something larger, something dangerous, and that her influence extended farther than he could imagine. And then the Marine realized that his perception of her, and of the world, had shifted entirely. He had gone from seeing her as just another woman in a bar to understanding that she was a professional operating at the highest levels, capable of executing missions he couldn't even comprehend. He had underestimated her in every possible way, and the reminder of that underestimation haunted him. One night he found himself standing outside the bar, staring at the neon lights flickering over the sidewalk. Memories of that night replayed vividly. The shove, the gaze, the subtle flick of her wristwatch, the commanding calm. The tension, the authority, the quiet dominance, all of it lingered like a pulse in the air. He knew that her life existed on a plane far above his own, a plane where rules, consequences, and danger operated differently. And yet he felt connected to it, tethered by the memory of that encounter, by the understanding of what he had survived. And just as he was about to turn away, he noticed a shadow across the street, a figure moving with familiar precision, purposeful, deliberate. His heart raced. Could it be her? Or was it someone else entirely? The faintest movement, the subtlest gesture, reminded him of the flickering green light on her wrist, the calm, unflinching gaze, the quiet warning that had left him stunned weeks ago. In that moment he realized, the encounter wasn't over. Her influence, her reach, her presence, real or symbolic, would linger in his life, shaping it in ways he couldn't yet see. He had been drawn into a world he didn't understand, a world of covert operations, danger, and hidden agendas. And he knew, deep down, that the next encounter could be far more consequential than the last. The Marine took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The world had shifted, subtly, irreversibly, and he had been a witness, an unwitting participant to a force beyond his comprehension. And somewhere beyond his vision, beyond his understanding, she was moving, calm, deliberate, lethal, and entirely unstoppable. He realized, with a mix of fear and fascination, that his life had been forever changed. He had glimpsed the edge of a reality that few ever touched, and the echo of her presence haunted him like a shadow he could never outrun. And in the silence of the night, with neon lights reflecting on rain-slicked streets, he understood. This was only the beginning. It started as a quiet morning, the kind that promised routine and predictability. The Marine had returned to base, trying to bury the memory of the bar incident deep inside his mind. He told himself it was over, that he could resume his life without fear or hesitation. But the moment he stepped onto the tarmac, the familiar hum of aircraft and distant chatter of colleagues did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. Every shadow seemed elongated, every glance more meaningful, as if he were still being watched by unseen eyes. He tried to focus on work, inspections, training, paperwork, but nothing distracted him from the lingering presence of her influence. Every movement, every subtle sound reminded him of the calm authority she wielded, the lethal grace she carried without effort, and the consequences of underestimating her. He could still see her eyes, piercing and unflinching, and hear her words in his head. "You assumed incorrectly." Then the call came. His phone buzzed with a message he didn't recognize, encrypted and urgent. "Stay alert. Operation imminent. Do not interfere, but be aware." His stomach churned. It was unmistakably from her, or at least from someone directly tied to her. The Marine's pulse quickened. He had no clearance, no understanding of the operation, and yet the message demanded immediate attention. Hours later, the Marine found himself outside a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He wasn't meant to be here, and he knew it. He stayed hidden, observing from the shadows, as a convoy of black SUVs slid silently into position. Armed operatives moved with precision, their coordination perfect, almost choreographed. And then he saw her, moving among them with a quiet authority that made his breath catch. She was not just present. She was in command, orchestrating an operation that seemed invisible, yet inevitable. The Marine's heart pounded as he watched her give subtle, almost imperceptible hand signals. Operatives responded instantly, adjusting positions, covering angles, communicating silently with nods and glances. Every movement was deliberate, efficient, and lethal in its precision. He realized in that moment that this wasn't just a mission. This was a symphony of danger, with her conducting from the center. He saw the target then, a convoy carrying something of immense value, guarded heavily but unaware of the imminent threat. The operatives moved with the grace of shadows, slipping through gaps, disabling security systems, neutralizing threats without a single shot being fired. The Marine's chest tightened. He had faced combat before, had been in high-stakes situations, but never had he witnessed such flawless coordination, such lethal efficiency without chaos. And then he realized the danger of his position. One wrong step, one misplaced breath, and he could be discovered, not by mere guards, but by the operatives trained to handle threats like him without hesitation. He tried to shrink further into the shadows, to become invisible, but it was nearly impossible. Every instinct screamed that he was too close, too exposed, and yet unable to look away. She moved again, slipping past the perimeter with the fluidity of someone who had been trained to vanish into shadows. The Marine's eyes followed, heart pounding, as she approached the convoy. He watched her assess the situation in a fraction of a second. Every angle, every weak point, every potential hazard accounted for. And then, with a simple gesture, she initiated the next phase of the operation. The Marine's stomach lurched as he witnessed the execution. Guards were subdued, vehicles immobilized, and what could have erupted into chaos remained eerily silent. Every action was calculated, precise, controlled. There was no room for error, no margin for hesitation. And through it all, she moved like a phantom, untouchable, unseen by all who didn't know where to look. He realized then that he had underestimated her entirely. She wasn't just dangerous in theory. She was lethal in practice, capable of dismantling threats with the kind of precision that left no trace. And yet, despite the danger, he felt an odd mixture of awe and fear. He had brushed against someone whose competence eclipsed everything he had ever known, and now he saw the full extent of her capabilities. Suddenly, one of the operatives glanced toward his hiding spot. The Marine froze, heart thundering in his chest. He had been discovered, or had he? The operative moved on, signaling someone else with a subtle nod, and he realized she had already anticipated his presence. It was almost as if she knew he was there, had accounted for his curiosity, and allowed him to witness only as much as he could handle without interference. The mission concluded with flawless execution. The target was secured, the operatives withdrew silently, and she vanished into the shadows just as quickly as she had arrived. The Marine stayed hidden, watching the aftermath, trying to process the scale of what he had witnessed. He felt the weight of insignificance pressing down on him, the realization that he had just observed someone operating on a level of skill, strategy, and composure that dwarfed his own experience. As he walked away from the warehouse, heart still pounding, he realized something unsettling. He was no longer just a bystander. He had seen her in action, and he had survived. That survival, he knew, was both a blessing and a warning. She had chosen not to acknowledge him during the operation, but her presence lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the world he had unwittingly entered. Back at his apartment, he replayed the events in his mind over and over. He thought about her calm authority, her precision, her ability to orchestrate an operation with flawless execution. He thought about the subtle signals, the tiny gestures, the unspoken commands that moved entire teams silently and efficiently. And he realized with a shiver that he had touched the surface of something far larger, far more dangerous than he could comprehend. And then his phone buzzed again. Another encrypted message, brief and deliberate. "You watched. Remember, not everything is safe to witness." No signature, no explanation, just a warning. The Marine's pulse spiked. He understood fully and completely that the operation he had witnessed was only a fragment of her world, and that he, an ordinary Marine, had glimpsed a force capable of things he could never imagine, and she had chosen to let him live. The Marine sat back, breathing heavily, heart still racing. He had survived contact with someone who was untouchable, someone whose competence and lethal precision operated on a level beyond comprehension. And he realized, with a mixture of fear, awe, and a strange sense of respect, that his life would never be the same again. Somewhere beyond the city she was moving again, always in motion, always vigilant, always commanding. And he knew with a chilling certainty that their paths were not finished intersecting. Because once you've glimpsed someone like her, nothing in your world can ever feel safe again. The Marine hadn't slept properly in days. Every sound, every shadow, every movement in his apartment felt magnified, as if the world itself were conspiring to remind him of her presence. He had replayed the bar incident, the subsequent messages, and the covert operation in his mind endlessly. He was haunted by her calm authority, her lethal precision, and the terrifying realization that she could dismantle threats without ever raising a hand. Then came the call he had been dreading and expecting. His phone buzzed with an encrypted alert, unfamiliar yet unmistakably connected to her. He hesitated before opening it, fingers trembling. The message was simple: "Tonight, intersection, be ready." Nothing else. No explanation, no context, no instructions, just a time and a place. He knew instinctively that ignoring it was not an option. Whatever awaited him tonight would reveal the full extent of her world, and his place in it, if any. Heart pounding, he grabbed his jacket and stepped into the cold night air. The city seemed quiet, deceptively so, as if it were holding its breath for what was about to unfold. The intersection was dimly lit, flickering streetlights casting long shadows across empty sidewalks. He arrived early, careful to remain unseen, scanning the surroundings with the hyper-awareness he had developed in the past weeks. Then he saw her. She emerged from the darkness like a ghost, her movements fluid, deliberate, and impossibly controlled. Her eyes locked onto his immediately, and in that instant he felt the familiar pull of fear and fascination. She was calm, untouchably calm, but every subtle movement carried meaning. Every micro-expression was a command, a calculation, a signal. "You came," she said softly, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of the street. No judgment, no anger, just a statement. I had to," he stammered. "I don't even know what's happening." Her lips curved in a faint smile, almost imperceptible. "You'll know soon enough, but be warned, this isn't a game." She paused, assessing him with the piercing intensity that had frozen him at the bar weeks ago. "You've been curious. That curiosity can get people killed." Before he could respond, headlights swept across the intersection. A convoy of black SUVs rolled in, identical to the one he had witnessed weeks earlier. His stomach churned. The operation wasn't just a mission, This was a demonstration, a warning, and he had been invited or summoned into the epicenter. She moved with precision, signaling silently to her team. Within seconds, operatives emerged from the shadows, surrounding the area with flawless coordination. The Marine's breath caught. Every move was choreographed, every angle covered, every potential threat neutralized before it even materialized. And through it all, she commanded the stage with an authority that made him feel both insignificant and alive. Then came the target, a vehicle, heavily armored, approaching slowly. He recognized it immediately from the previous operation, a high-value asset, critical and heavily protected. The operatives adjusted positions silently, like shadows converging on a prey that had no idea it was already ensnared. The Marine felt a surge of adrenaline. He wanted to look away, to leave, to avoid this world entirely. But he couldn't. He was drawn in, tethered by the events of the past weeks, by her presence, by the terrifying allure of witnessing someone who operated beyond ordinary comprehension. She moved closer to him, silently assessing. "Stay back," she warned softly, but the tone was not a command, it was a test. She wanted to see if he would follow, if he would remain calm, if he could survive proximity to the storm she commanded effortlessly. The operation unfolded with breathtaking precision. Guards were incapacitated with minimal force. Surveillance systems were overridden. The vehicle was secured without a single shot fired, and through it all she moved like a shadow, untouchable, untethered, unstoppable. The Marine's heart raced as he watched, realizing that she didn't just neutralize threats, she erased them from the equation entirely. She was not only a warrior, she was a strategist, a phantom, a force that reshaped reality around her presence. Every instinct he had honed as a Marine paled in comparison to the effortless control she wielded. Finally, the operation concluded. The convoy vanished, the operatives melted into the night, and she turned to him, calm yet exuding a quiet intensity that made his knees weak. "You survived," she said simply, nodding, the awe and fear etched across his face. I don't understand," he admitted, voice shaking. "How do you do all of this?" She studied him silently, her eyes reflecting the weight of countless missions, countless dangers, countless lives touched by her precision. "Discipline," she said finally, "training, awareness, and understanding that the world is bigger than any one person realizes. You stumbled into my world and you survived. That's all you need to know for now." He exhaled, relief and awe flooding through him. But then, a flicker of movement in the shadows reminded him that this world was never safe, never still. He realized that while she had spared him, she operated in a constant state of vigilance, and any complacency on his part could be deadly. As she moved to leave, she paused, her eyes locked onto his one final time. "Remember what you saw tonight," she said, voice low and commanding. "The world isn't what it seems, and curiosity can be a dangerous thing." Before he could respond, she vanished into the night, swallowed by shadows and silence, leaving him standing alone in the intersection. The city lights flickered overhead, casting the empty street in a surreal glow. His mind raced, adrenaline coursing through every vein, heart pounding, eyes scanning the darkened streets for any sign of her. He realized, with a mixture of fear, awe, and disbelief, that his life had been forever altered. He had crossed paths with someone extraordinary, someone operating at a level he could never hope to achieve or fully understand. He had survived contact with a force of nature disguised as an ordinary woman, and that knowledge would haunt him forever. As he walked away from the intersection, he understood the truth. He had glimpsed a reality most people never see, a world of danger, precision, and lethal efficiency. And somewhere out there, she was still moving, still vigilant, still unstoppable. And he knew deep down that their paths would cross again. Because once you've touched someone like her world, you can never go back to ordinary. And somewhere in the shadows, she smiled.